Sometimes, unexpected things happen at unexpected times. It's just how life works. December 8th, 1976. The production crew for the hit television series The $6 Million Man is filming an episode at an amusement area formerly known as the Pike in Long Beach, California. A popular amusement zone for the better half of a century, the Pike was chosen by the production team as a location to film Season 4, Episode 20, Carnival of Spies. Production of the episode was going as expected, and it just seemed like a regular day in the making of the $6 Million Man. And yet no one knew of the gruesome discovery that was about to be made on the set of this seemingly ordinary episode. On one of the amusement park's several attractions, a seemingly unimportant wax mannequin hanging from the gallows was discovered to not be a mannequin at all. It was something more gruesome, something more bone-chilling. It was the dead, mummified body of an unidentified man. The crew, now confused and wanting answers, did not hesitate to call the police to the scene. Why was this corpse just found hanging out in a funhouse? Literally. Even when the police arrived, it was still a mystery as to whose body this belonged to and how it got to a random amusement park attraction in Long Beach, California. So many questions, and yet so few answers. Let me just ask you a simple question, and I hope you can answer this as honestly as you can. Have you or a loved one ever get disowned by your parents, then become a machine gun operator in the United States Army, then became a bank and train robber, then die, then become an Undertaker side gig, then become a traveling museum piece, then become a prop in several films, then get hung in the gallows of an abandoned amusement park attraction, then get discovered by the crew of one of the most successful television shows of the 1970s? That's what I thought. No one, and I mean not a single soul on set that day knew the journey this man had been through. But we do now, and the story you are about to be told is legendarily worthy. You are about to witness the incredible life and afterlife of one Elmer McCurdy, the most interesting person in human history. So, how did we get here? Washington is a fairly quaint town located in the southern portion of Maine. Home to only around 1,600 today, this small town is the start of our big story, and it's all thanks to one man born here on January 1st, 1880. Elmer J. McCurdy was the son of 17-year-old Sadie McCurdy, and from the very beginning it would become clear that dysfunction runs in the family. It all started with the ambiguous identity of Elmer's father, with some believing it was Sadie's cousin Charles Smith. Yeah, I know, Sweet Home Washington, Maine, but due to this fear of raising an illegitimate child, young Elmer was quickly given to her brother George. After George pulled an 1800s on us and died of tuberculosis when Elmer was just 10, Sadie and Helen moved to the larger city of Bangor, Maine. Eventually, Sadie broke the news to young Elmer that she was his real mother, not Helen, which definitely seemed to rub him the wrong way. This is around the time where Elmer grew resentful, unruly, rebellious, and developed a drinking problem, a tragic downturn that would continue for the rest of his life. McCurdy ended up living with his grandfather afterwards and became a skilled plumber, but even this chapter in his life would end abruptly and with tragedy. Not only did he lose his job to economic turmoil, but he lost both his mom and his grandpa in 1900. With no other family to turn to, the lonely McCurdy left Maine to go work odd jobs throughout the country, jobs he couldn't hold for long due to his rampant alcoholism. He moved to Kansas, residing in Cherryvale to work once again as a plumber, then to Iola where he got arrested for public intoxication in 1905, and finally residing in Webb City, Missouri. What a depressing life. It would seem like nothing but an endless downward spiral for our good old buddy Elmer, so to get his destiny on track for once, he joined the US Army as a machine gun operator in 1907. Stationed at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas as a part of the 13th Infantry, he would stick around in the Quartermaster Corps until being honorably discharged on November 7, 1910. The most important aspect of his service was being trained, albeit minimally, to blow up stuff with nitroglycerin, a trade Elmer would use in future endeavors. One of these endeavors took place shortly after he was discharged, where he would meet up with an army buddy in St. Joseph, Kansas. It was then, November 19th, 1910, he would be arrested for the second time in his life for possession of burglary paraphernalia, which was essentially stuff used to blow up other stuff. During his arraignment, he was able to convince the jury that he and his friend were inventing a new foot-operated machine gun and got off scot-free. Oh, but what a little spark of inspiration can do to someone. Because whether it be his past ineptitude, tragic upbringing, or rebellious nature, from this point until the very end, our beloved anti-hero would come to embrace lawlessness and crime. The alcoholic, diseased, troubled, and inept Elmer J. McCurdy would come to spend his final months as a clumsy yet fearless bank and train robber. In 1911, Elmer would permanently relocate to Lenapaw, Oklahoma, and it was from here that he would kick off his criminal career. A criminal career filled with clumsiness and ineptitude, a deadly combination that would lead to his own demise. And it started on March 24th of that year. Elmer would gather with 3 other men looking to rob the Missouri Iron Mountain Express train, which was said to have contained a safe with around $3,000. According to the engineer on board during the robbery, James Lynch, it all started when 2 men were seen jumping in between cars on the train. Wondering what was going on, the engineer turned the train to the firemen, only for the 2 men to pull revolvers on the crew. With the threat in place, the other 2 men stood on the track and ordered the stopping of the train 3 miles north of Lenapaw. They then jumped on and ordered the crew to give them access to the vault. It was now time for Elmer to do his job. With the crew hostage, McCurdy placed the first charge of nitroglycerin, which only blew open the outer door of the vault. Unfortunately for him, his next charges may have been a little too effective. Not only did he blow the rest of it wide open, he also destroyed most of the money contained within. While early reports stated that Elmer and his crew netted $20,000, in total they really only nabbed around a couple hundred in silver coins, most of which were literally fused onto the safe itself after the explosion. Most weren't even sure if they could have even profited off of such a sloppy ordeal, as not only was most of the money destroyed, but also much of it was insured for more than $500. Whatever the case was, one thing was clear: this seemed like just another devastating failure in the life of Elmer McCurdy. But if there's anything we've learned so far, it's that Elmer pushes onward. Even if the net results weren't spectacular, at least McCurdy got away without any run-ins with the law. Hopefully it wouldn't hurt to try again, and this time get away with far more. 6 months after the disastrous Katy train robbery, Elmer and 2 others decided to rob a Citizens Bank in Chautauqua, Kansas. It was a far cry from the adrenaline rush of train hopping, but after what happened last time, it's fair to say that he wanted to go with something a little safer. In the veil of night on September 21st, 1911, the 3 would break into the bank vault with a sledgehammer. With access to the vault, Elmer once again used the good old nitroglycerin to crack it wide open. But once again, his failure came back to bite him. While the first charge was successful at blowing out the outer door clean without any monetary loss, the second round meant to crack it fully open failed to even charge. It seemed that all hope was lost even before the fun began, as the lookout guy was scared away due to the possible disturbance that could have been caused by the initial explosion. Once again, Elmer and company would have to take the easy way out, only netting a mere $150 in silver coins located on top of the vault and causing about $1,000 worth in damage along the way. An even lesser gain and greater disappointment than the last affair. Any sane person who has had this much failure, this much ineptitude, this much go wrong in the face of crime would certainly give up right then and there and go home. But if you haven't already noticed, Elmer is no sane person. It's a miracle in itself that he has been able to cover his tracks so well, to the point where the law doesn't even have a clue who has been doing all these robberies. Elmer was the bandit who wouldn't give up, and unfortunately for him, next time he would pay the ultimate price. That very night, Elmer and the gang hopped on a train to the Kansas border, where they split up. McCurdy would eventually find his way to a friend, Charlie Reverd, where he would stay and drink heavily at his ranch near Bartsville, Oklahoma. It is here that he would plan what would become his last stand. Elmer would learn of a train carrying $400,000 in cash, intended as a payment to the Osage Nation. If he succeeded, this would be a clean slate, a robbery worth so much it would make McCurdy's past failures seem like small flashes in the pan. If he didn't succeed, then well, let's just say Elmer's criminal career would simply be helpless. On October 4th, 1911, near Okessa, Oklahoma, Elmer and two others stopped the Katy train for his third robbery attempt, aiming to make it big once and for all. He jumped on the wrong train. Once again, this story sounds so much like a broken record you can make a John Boy's Dorktown video about it. Elmer fails for the third time to get what he wants, as instead of stopping the cargo train containing the prized cash, he stops the number 29 passenger train heading southbound, and Elmer would have to make the best out of a bad situation. Again, for the third time. He and his crew stole just $46 from a mail clerk, 2 jugs of whiskey, a revolver, a coat, and the train conductor's watch. A far cry from the $400,000 that had reportedly been sitting in the train headed towards Osage. A newspaper later called it one of the smallest in the history of train robbery. If only he had picked the right one. Look, even I can't explain why Elmer McCurdy was such a bad criminal, but whatever it may be, he seemed to get the memo. He returned to Reverend's ranch, only to hang out with the ranch hands, drink all the whiskey he stole, and sleep in the haylofts in the barn. He was ill from working in the mines, drunk, and unbeknownst to him, the law had finally caught up. A reward of $2,000 had been put up to find and convict the perpetrators, and McCurdy was the prime suspect. Using bloodhounds and neighbors, 3 sheriffs, brothers Bob and Stringer Fenton and Dick Wallace, had been tracked to the barn where McCurdy stayed, waiting for the break of the October 7th dawn. Elmer, knowing the law was waiting but not wanting to give up without a fight, shot at the 3 sheriffs. They shot back, and the cycle would continue for hours on end. But then, silence. The 3 sheriffs discovered a man lying on his back, revolver in hand, with a gunshot wound to the chest. Elmer McCurdy, the diseased, drunk, and inept bandit, was dead at 31. For most in his situation, this was a fitting end. The law had to catch up at some point, and for all the failure Elmer went through, it's a miracle it didn't happen sooner. But remember that Elmer is the bandit who wouldn't give up, and even through death, his body would stick to this motto. This could have been the end of McCurdy's story, but frankly, it was just the beginning. After Elmer's death, his corpse was taken to the local undertaker and funeral home owner Joseph J. Johnson in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Of course, no one came to claim him as kin, which makes sense because, most of his family either died or was abandoned during his cross-country endeavors. Since he couldn't bury the body or hold a funeral until he was paid for his services, Johnson did what any person would with a spare body lying around: make a little bit of moolah. And so he got McCurdy photographed for future reference, tended the gunshot wound, filled Elmer's body with a preservative, cleaned him up, dressed him in street clothes, put a rifle in his hands, propped him up in the corner of the funeral home, and just like that, he had another business. For a mere nickel, you could see the bandit who wouldn't give up, or the mystery man of many aliases, or the Oklahoma Outlaw, or even the Embalmed Bandit. Yeah, Elmer had a lot of nicknames both before and after his death. During his criminal career, he went by Frank Amos, Frankie Curtis, Frank Davis, Frank Davidson, Frank Day, Frank Ellis, Elmer McAudrey, Elmer McCarty, Elmer McCurdy, Elmer McCurdy, Elmer McCurda, Elmer McCready, and even Charles Smith. A name so boring that no one would get suspicious of you robbing the local bank. Hey, doesn't that sound familiar? Almost overnight, Elmer's body became a local hit. It became a popular attraction at the funeral home and caught the attention of carnival promoters who wanted to buy the corpse off of Johnson. Wanting to keep his dead cash cow alive, he denied these offers. That was until he got a call nearly 5 years after Elmer's death. On the other end of the phone was a man who identified as Aver, who claimed to be the long-lost brother of Elmer McCurdy from California, and that he had arrangements for the body to be shipped to San Francisco to be buried. Aver and his friend Wayne would arrive at the funeral home 2 days later to pick up the body and send it on a train to San Francisco. It would seem that Elmer would finally get the proper burial he was never able to have. But you see how much time we still have left. McCurdy's story is far from over. So where was that train actually headed? Why, Arkansas City, Kansas, of course, where the Great Patterson Carnival was in town. It turned out that the real identities of Aver and Wayne were brothers James and Charles Patterson, who heard about the successful exhibit and concocted a plan to hijack the corpse for their traveling carnival. Their plan worked to perfection, and Elmer would be exhibited around the country under the hilariously "we really want to be the original without it looking like we're copying them" name, "The Outlaw who wouldn't be captured alive." You can't even tell the difference. Oh yeah, and the funny part? Johnson didn't know any of this until the carnival moved on to Texas. Elmer's body would stay in the Pattersons' possession until 1922, when they defaulted on a loan and were forced to sell the carnival business to Louis Sonny, who ran the world-famous Museum of Crime. McCurdy, now pretty much totally mummified and in a sleek new casket, would now be featured alongside wax replicas of famous outlaws such as Bill Dooley and Jesse James. The museum touted that instead of Elmer being captured alive, he drank poison which allowed for his body to be preserved. Sonny was only supposed to keep the body for a month before returning it back to the traveling carnival, but it seemed that the Patterson brothers didn't care enough to come back for it, and so Elmer stayed in the possession of the Sonny family for over 50 years. But this is the moment where, as gruesome as it was, for Elmer's corpse to truly become a nationwide star. Unlike the first two proprietors, Sonny was more open to allowing Elmer's body to be featured in other places, promotions, and media. Mind you, the corpse was so mummified at this point that it started to shrink and shrivel up, but even this wouldn't stop the most eccentric of patrons to find Elmer amusing. He was featured in the accompanying show alongside the Trans-American Foot Race in 1928, and was used to promote the low-budget exploitation film Narcotic in 1933. Sources say that Elmer was propped in the lobbies of movie theaters, where director Dwayne Esper told moviegoers that the Bandit was a drug fiend whose deteriorated skin was a sign of his abuse. All of this, while Elmer was in between the traveling shows of Sonny's Museum of Crime, which continued until Louis Sonny's death in 1949. Afterwards, the body was placed in the hands of Louis' son, Dan, who put Elmer into retirement inside an LA warehouse. End of story, right? Wrong! In 1964, famed B-movie director David F. Friedman took interest in the body and decided to make a deal with Dan Sonny to borrow it. Elmer would then make his only credited film appearance in 1967's She-Freak. He's credited as a straight-up movie prop, by the way. During his tenure with Elmer, he described him as greasy and rubbery and having a loose arm, which was apparently caused by Sonny wanting to play a prank on one of his assistants. This will become important in a minute. Eventually, Elmer's corpse was given back to Sonny and sold for $10,000 in 1971 to Spoonie Singh of the Hollywood Wax Museum, who bought it on behalf of two Canadian men who wanted to tour the body at Mount Rushmore. Unfortunately, the now extremely petrified, broken, and beat-up McCurdy corpse literally lost its ears, fingers, and toes in a windstorm while being exhibited, and the gruesome, unlively body was promptly returned to Singh. Elmer's body was then sold for the very final time to Ed Learsh, the part owner of the Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach. He went through yet another casket change and was dubbed the Thousand-Year-Old Man, who at first hung outside the Laugh in the Dark attraction at the park, but was later moved inside as a prop with a fresh new coat of paint. Hanging in the gallows, this is where he would stay, or at least until a certain multi-million-dollar man came around. And so, after all this time, after all these adventures, we find ourselves back at the $6 Million Man set at the Pike in Long Beach, where a crew member decided to move what was thought to be a simple prop mannequin. The already fragile arm then broke off, revealing bone and tissue, signaling that this was no ordinary prop. Police were called, and the body was examined at the LA coroner's office. Even through the extreme petrification of the corpse, the police were able to identify the body as an adult male who had died of a gunshot wound, finding within the body a 1924 penny, a few ticket stubs to the Pike and the Museum of Crime, and the premier piece, the now rusty fatal bullet that pointed to the time of death. Tests even showed tuberculosis in the lungs and traces of the arsenic embalming fluid that was used. Dan Sonny was called onto the scene to confirm who it was, and all evidence, both forensic and testimonial, pointed to this being the one and only Elmer McCurdy. At At this point, the news media started to become intrigued with this unique story, and soon enough, Elmer's wild tale began to spread worldwide. Many funeral homes wanted to bury the body for free, but eventually the body was taken into custody by Fred Olds of the Oklahoma Territorial Museum. The final decision was made. Elmer would be taken back to Oklahoma to be buried at Boot Hill, located at Summit View Cemetery in Guthrie. 500 people would show up on April 22nd, 1977 to see the black, velvet-curtained, old-style hearse drawn by two white horses trot to the final resting place of McCurdy. As the casket and protective concrete lowered into the red Oklahoma dirt next to famed outlaw Bill Dooley, a somber sign swept the crowd. This was the end of a nearly 100-year-old ongoing journey. A journey of misfortune, ineptitude, incompetence, and pure fate. A journey that transcended the barrier of life and death. This is the end of Elmer McCurdy. You know, I'm sure to bet that 99.9% of us watching this video won't become all that famous once our time is up. When we're lowered 6 feet under, we'll often feel more like a number in the grand scheme of things. A singular drop in the sea of over 8 billion. Sometimes you'll get the extraordinary few that do become the rich and the famous, but for most of us out there, it's hard to deny that we will ever truly be known. But sometimes, there's the relatable anti-hero, the great legend, whose pure fate leads to a special phenomenon that you just have to see to believe. Throughout all the family drama, failed robberies, and afterlife shenanigans, there's one thing in Elmer McCurdy's travels that remained the same. He just kept on going places. Through life, through death, through fortune and misfortune, there's a journey to be had, and a story to be told. And more than 45 years after that journey ended, the story is what remains. There's been quite a few books, documentaries, and TV shows that have mentioned or even centered on the McCurdy tale that I've become oh so attached to throughout this, but mine centers on a claim that no others would dare to make. Feel free to disagree, but in my opinion, through the peril and adventure, Elmer McCurdy is the most interesting person in human history. Hey, I mean, someone's gotta be. This has been BrayBray, thanks for watching, and remember that Buff Yoshi is forever supreme. When it comes to lost international dubs for TV shows,